do all of my football tape grinding, and tonight we're going to do another draft sim. That is right, it is a Saturday night draft sim. Here it is on the iPad, just like NFL teams will be using. I've got my Diet Dr. Pepper ready here, and so we're going to be focusing on the Vikings in the first round, but taking a little bit of a different angle for this one. So last time we tried on the Saturday Night Draft Sim to just fill as many needs as we possibly could. But with this one, what I want to do is I want to make this a make Kirk Cousins better draft sim. That is the main goal here. So we're saying to Mike Zimmer, hey, buddy, you're great at defensive scheme and you've been developing these other draft picks for quite some time. So get after it because we're not giving you all the cornerbacks that you so desire. Now, I understand that that might not be the most realistic outcome because the Vikings will most certainly want to restock the cupboard when it comes to their cornerbacks. If they decide to move on from Anthony Harris, then we're going to see them very likely draft a safety that can slide in there next to Harrison Smith. And if Everson Griffin does indeed leave, which who knows where he's going to sign, but I would still say it's a possibility, a small one, that he could come back to the Vikings. But let's say he doesn't and he signs with wherever, Seattle or something, then they need a defensive end. They need another pass rusher. And at this moment, you can even make an argument that they need an interior rusher as well. So there's a lot on the defensive side that the Vikings need. But here's my argument. They have two corners that they like in Holton Hill and Mike Hughes. So let's assume those guys are in. There are still a handful of free agent corners that they could still go out and get. There are still a couple of free agent pass rushers that they could go out and get. And they've developed players over the years like Armin Watts, Jaleel Johnson, Afadi Adenabo. Looks like he's ready to be a starting defensive end. And in the past, some of these places, the Vikings have done a great job in terms of developing players who were not first-round draft picks. Guys like Everson Griffin himself or Daniil Hunter, or at the safety position, how about Anthony Harris, undrafted, and he becomes a star in the league and one of PFF's highest rated safeties from an undrafted player. So let's, for the purposes of trying to make Kirk Cousins better, to take some unique angles on our draft sims, let's see what we can do in this scenario. So we're ignoring corner for the most part. We're ignoring pass rusher until maybe the third round. We'll see. But our main focus is how can we give Kirk more protection and more receiving options, more playmakers. All right. So I'm looking at my draft board right now here, and if you want to jump into the comments, that's totally fine. We can go back and forth on how we're making these picks and things like that. And if you guys feel like I did something wrong or you wanted somebody else, then feel free to jump in there. But right now, looking at my draft board, we've seen the top wide receivers go off the board just before the Vikings pick. And I'm using fanspeak.com, but Pro Football Focus has also released their newest draft simulator, which is pretty cool too. The Draft Network has one. So if you guys want to draft sim yourselves and then send them along to me on Twitter, it's at Matthew Coller. You're always free to do that. Go ahead. So looking at the way the board played out, just before the Vikings came up, Jerry Jeudy went to the Dallas Cowboys at 17. CeeDee Lamb went at 18 to the Miami Dolphins. And as I'm looking at it, surprisingly, tackle Josh Jones, a guy that I think should be of intrigue to the Vikings. He goes earlier to the Denver Broncos at number 15. That surprised me. Also, Justin Jefferson, he went to the 49ers at 13. Henry Ruggs was already off the board. So none of the top tier wide receivers are on the board for me. But there are still some guys in terms of playmakers that I like. The offensive line is a little weaker here at 22 on the board that I'm looking at in this draft simulation. So I've got T. Higgins as the best playmaker on the board. That's not a running back. Obviously, it wouldn't make sense to draft a running back in the first round for the Vikings. But the guy that I'm really intrigued by is Laviska Chenault Jr. out of Colorado, a special type of playmaker. And if you're thinking about somebody who can come right in right away and make a difference by just getting the ball in his hands, think about this. If Mike Zimmer sort of hit the reset button on Cordero Patterson and handled it right and just found ways to get Cordero Patterson the ball. Remember that Zimmer said he felt he made a mistake in the way the Vikings used Cordell Patterson, that they should have put him in the backfield more often. They should have thrown in more screens. Well, Laviska Chenault would give them that opportunity to have that pure playmaker who, on year one, even if they're just getting them the ball on short passes, can make plays and allow Adam Thielen to be your more consistent deep receiver and BC Johnson to develop, and other players that they've drafted, who knows, maybe Alexander Hollins or Dylan Mitchell, somebody like that, steps up into the limelight a little bit. But this would give you your complete receiver in Adam Thielen and your playmaker in Laviska Chenault, and you hope that he stays healthy. I mean, that is certainly a concern. There's no doubt about that. And you might feel like it's a little bit of a stretch. But when our focus is, let's make Kirk Cousins better with this draft simulation, that's the guy I'm going to go with at number 22. So I've selected Laviska Chenault. Now, interestingly, on the draft board at that time was, and still is at 25, both Jordan Love and Justin Herbert. Now, that's kind of mind-blowing because I don't see that happening. I think we're going to have 4 quarterbacks that are taken pretty high here. But if the Vikings had their chance to get either one of those two, I wonder if a lot of fans would sign up for a quarterback that they could start to develop. I personally think spending a first-round pick on a quarterback when your quarterback is under contract for 3 more years is a pretty tough thing to do when you have a lot of positions that still need to be filled. So I'm not going to draft either one of those guys. But if they did it, I wouldn't criticize it because you're always looking to get that next quarterback on a rookie contract, and it's the most valuable position. I just don't have a ton of belief in either Love or Herbert as being great NFL quarterbacks. So looking at the draft board now, it's played out much better for defensive players and defensive playmakers here. You have Christian Fulton on the board still, a cornerback. You also have Grant Delpit, a deep safety. A.J. Terrell is on the board. So if the Vikings were looking to rebuild their defense, they would really be liking the way that this played out. However, Austin Jackson, the tackle from USC, still on the board with the 25th pick. This might be a reach, just like Chenault in some people's mind. I think if you were going with just pure pick the best player available, rebuild the defense, some of those other guys that I named, Trayvon Diggs, Ross Blacklock is the defensive tackle for TCU. You might pick those guys, but if our goal is to give Kirk Cousins everything he can get on the offensive side, then we're going to go with Austin Jackson, the tackle out of USC. Now, here's my thinking about why this might make sense. Even though it would be tough to convince Mike Zimmer not to draft defensive players, because that's how they built their number one defense in 2017, was drafting first-rounders like Harrison Smith, Xavier Rhodes, Trey Waynes, second-rounder Eric Kendricks, third-rounder Danielle Hunter. That's how they built it up, and I get that. But if you look at the recent teams that have gone to the Super Bowl, almost all of them have top 5 scoring offenses. That 2015 Broncos team looks pretty well in the past now. And think about the Atlanta Falcons that went to the Super Bowl in 2016 with a similar style Kubiak-Shanahan offense, and they were number 1 in the league that year offensively. Of course, Tom Brady's Patriots, the Rams that went to the Super Bowl with Jared Goff, and even the San Francisco 49ers, though they didn't have a ton of passing yards in total, were still one of the most efficient passing games. So if we're trying to make the quarterback better and saying, look, if Jared Goff and Jimmy Garoppolo went to Super Bowls with a top-tier offense, the Vikings can too, whether it's this year, next year, whatever. So give them as many weapons as they could possibly get. And people love to bring up the 49ers running game. Think about who they added to their offense, though, with someone like Deebo Samuel. We want Laviska Chenault to be that guy. So that's what we've got. We go into the second round, and we see some more offensive linemen going off the board. One of you asked about Antoine Winfield Jr. He goes in the middle of the second round. That makes a lot of sense for this draft sim that we're doing right now. And a lot of defensive players being picked. The offensive tackle, Isaiah Wilson, who's like a high ceiling but high risk type of guy, he gets selected. And then Ezra Cleveland, someone I'm really intrigued by for the Minnesota Vikings, because he reminds me a lot of Brian O'Neill. He got picked just before the Dolphins, by the Dolphins, just before the Vikings came up. But if you look at his athletic profile, consider that he's not come from a top school, he has a lot of Brian O'Neill in him. So on the board right now, if I'm still going with the goal to try and make Kirk Cousins better, I can get a guard here. And would anyone argue, would any Minnesota Vikings fan argue that the Vikings shouldn't take two offensive linemen, considering that you signed Kirk Cousins to an $84 million contract and you can't build him a good pass protecting line in two straight seasons? It makes a lot of sense to me to try to rebuild the offensive line. So even though there are players again on this board that I really like for the Minnesota Vikings, Jordan Elliott is one of them out of Missouri. He's a three technique pass rusher who could have a very high ceiling. Also, Jalen Johnson, the corner out of Utah. I heard an interview with him on Pro Football Focus's 2-for-1 podcast. I suggest going to find it. Very smart sounding guy, would want him all day. But if our goal is making Kirk Cousins better, they don't have any guards right now. I mean, Pat Elflein might have to continue to play guard next season just because they don't have anyone else except for Brett Jones and Dakota Dozier. Those guys are backups. They cut Josh Klein. So what we're going to do is we're going to add somebody who is considered just a big old beast at the guard position. So even if we throw him in there and he's not 100% up to speed with the NFL game, his athleticism, his strength, his size will help him, along with the fact that the Vikings do have a really well-proven offensive line coach in Rick Dennison. We're going to get Netani Muti out of Fresno State. So tell me what you guys in the comments think so far. We have Laviska Chenault Jr., the playmaking wide receiver out of Colorado. Then with the second pick, Austin Jackson, the tackle out of USC, a very athletic tackle that probably fits really well with what Gary Kubiak wants to do. And then Netani Muti. So we've drafted no one on defense. Mike Zimmer is in his house losing it. He's at the ranch in northern Kentucky freaking out. But Kirk Cousins is happy as a clam wherever he is with a new playmaker and two more offensive linemen. So we go into the third round, and we've got options here. We can go with another offensive lineman, which, again, I don't think any Vikings fans would complain about. But on the draft board here, we also have some interesting wide receivers that drop into the third round. One of them being Minnesota's Tyler Johnson. I really like Tyler Johnson. I know there are some criticisms of him. Maybe he's not going to run a 4.340, or he's not going to jump 42 inches and have an NBA type of ability to jump up. But watching him play a lot for Minnesota, he was a guy that made contested catches and was a terrific route runner and found himself open all the time. And I think it's a good idea because I'm looking at my board right now here on the iPad, and I'm seeing some defensive players that you might want if you're the Vikings. Jeremy Shinn is one of them from Southern Illinois. He's got high praise from a lot of people as somebody who could fit right in. And, Lamar Jackson, not the Lamar Jackson, but a cornerback out of Nebraska, might be somebody that you would want to look at. But the best pick on the board right here in the third round that I'm looking at is probably to go with either Tyler Johnson or Van Jefferson out of Florida. Van Jefferson, really talented guy, but didn't have the production of Tyler Johnson. And the tie, in my mind, has to go to the producer. And I'm going to go with Tyler Johnson here, not just because of the Minnesota connection, but because I really enjoyed watching him play football. And I think that he's good at the things that make you a good NFL player as a wide receiver. So route running, detailed route running, contested catches. I know some of you still have PTSD from the contested catches of Laquan Treadwell, and I understand that. But you're usually having to jump up over someone or make a catch on a 50-50 ball in the NFL, and separation is the biggest thing. Tyler Johnson was great at that. So in our Make Kirk Cousins Better draft, we have kind of a pure route running wide receiver, a playmaking receiver, two offensive linemen, and with my last third round pick, where should I go in this direction? I can get another receiver, but that might be just too much at this point. I can go with another offensive lineman. I think here is probably where we do end up going with someone on defense because it's just how the board is played out. We could get another guard, we could get another receiver, but I'm not sure where those guys would even fit at this point on the roster. So let's go with the corner out of Nebraska. Let's go with the safety out of Southern Illinois, Jeremy Shinn. We'll get him. And that completes this draft sim. Now I want to do another one here that so we can talk about it if the Vikings decided to just please Mike Zimmer and make him very happy. This This is Kirk Cousins' ideal draft sim. And we end up with Laviska Chenault, Austin Jackson, Natani Muti, Tyler Johnson, and Jeremy Shin, the third round safety from Southern Illinois. So give me a grade in the comments. Chad asks about Lloyd Cushenberry. I just don't think that Lloyd Cushenberry really fits the athletic profile. When I'm trying to figure out which guys the Vikings might be really interested in, I'm looking more at they want guys who are a little smaller, a little more athletic. But I mean, he played for the top team against great competition and was a very good player, and apparently has like through the roof type of character too. So I mean, if they picked Lloyd Cushenberry, I wouldn't be surprised. I do think they're going to give Garrett Bradbury a lot of time at the center position. So give me a grade on that one. If you were Kirk Cousins and you're in your house, would you be happy with them getting a playmaking receiver, a route running receiver, and two offensive linemen out of those first 5 picks? Now let's try to do this again. And give me a second here, because at fanspeak.com, what I'm using for this draft sim, you have to add in what type of things you want, like how many rounds, what team you want to draft for. So give me just a second to type those in, and I'll continue to read the comments as we do that. But if you're asking which way would surprise you the most, but would also make a lot of sense, I think it's the make Kirk Cousins better draft. Mostly because offense and passing game are driving the success in the NFL. I mean, that's kind of where it starts for me. Is I think you can scheme your way and develop your way and still have also enough talent with Harrison Smith, Danielle Hunter, and so forth, to be able to be a good defense this year. Not a great defense, but there were problems with last year's defense, and they still finished at the top of the league, toward the top of the league in points against. So, this year things will get a little harder, having to play the NFC South. You're going to have Matt Ryan, Tom Brady, Drew Brees again. But, in a way, you would love to see the Vikings go all in on the huge investment that they made in the 2018 offseason. And without adding offensive linemen in this draft, it'll feel like they still have left Kirk Cousins a little bit out to dry. And Cousins is coming off of his best season. But if he regresses even a little bit in terms of his play, it's not like at this moment he's going to have an offensive line to keep him more protected than he was last year. Now, some of Kirk Cousins' problems with pressure are his own, but that only enhances your need to get better on the offensive line. And of course, the Trent Williams idea is still out there. If I'm the Minnesota Vikings, I'm trying to do that because it's very rare that you get your hands on somebody that good. And they have the draft capital to be able to do that in a trade, or they can maybe release Anthony Harris, draft a safety like Antoine Winfield Jr., and use the cap space to sign Trent Williams to a contract extension that has a low cap hit in the first year and then gets bigger down the road. So here we are again at 22. Now, this version of the draft sim, I'm going to do the Make Mike Zimmer Happy draft sim, and then we'll decide which one we like better, okay? So where I've got on the board right now, Xavier McKinney, I really like out of Alabama. Instinctual player, can play up in the box, can play the deep safety if you need him to. I like him a lot. AJ Epinesa, another guy. He's being criticized by some people for his combine performance. He didn't do well enough in the 3-cone and things like that. Now, look, I don't fancy myself the most expert of all draft experts, but I tend to think that if somebody can dominate in the Big Ten and just maul the Minnesota Gophers in a very good Gophers team, very good Gophers offensive line, that I like what I see from AJ Epinesa. Also, Christian Fulton, we talked to him on the show the other day. Sounds like a bright kid out of LSU. He only allowed 31 completions on 70 attempts his way, and that was sometimes going up against your T. Higgins type of talent, your Jerry Jeudy type of talent. I like what Christian Fulton brings to the table. Jeff Gladney, the TCU corner, is also on the board here for this draft sim. And so this is a tough decision. Do we go with the idea of bringing in a safety and moving on from Anthony Harris, a first-round safety? The guy better be good if he's going to be a first-round safety, because you think about that position next to Harrison Smith, two undrafted guys have emerged as very good players there. So that's why I'm going to go on the outside corner. I'm going to go with Jeff Gladney out of TCU. He is a little bit undersized from the type of prospect that they've usually gone with, but really strong. So normally, if somebody on the outside, in terms of what the Vikings like, isn't of their height requirement, they want him to be able to bench. They want the reps there, and I think he's got a good chance to be a really good player. So I'm going to go with Jeff Gladney. Mike Zimmer is celebrating now. He's very happy. You've gotten your cornerback. And now we are on to the 25th pick. And in between, two receivers have gone, T. Higgins and Denzel Mims. So now I can do whatever I want here again. I can get Xavier McKinney. I can get A.J. Epinesa. I can go with A.J. Terrell, Christian Fulton. I have my choice. Ross Blacklock and Antoine Winfield Jr. These guys are all on the board for me still. And, you know, this is the thing about this year with the Gophers. A lot of times in the past, people would look at, the Gophers prospects and say, well, maybe this guy's got a chance, maybe that guy's got a chance. And every once in a while, you get an Eric Decker and somebody turns out. But mostly it's eye roll when it comes to the Gophers prospects. This year is not the case. This year, I think they're legit. Now, in reality, I would want the Vikings to trade down and see how far back they could go to still get Antoine Winfield Jr. But I'm going to go in his direction. I think that Epinesa is a good player. I think that Fulton's a really good player. But when you can have somebody who's versatile in the secondary, like we saw with Tyrann Mathieu and the Kansas City Chiefs, it helps a ton. So I'm going to select Antoine Winfield Jr. with the second pick in the Mike Zimmer draft set. So let's go on to the second round here. Chad wants, in the comments, wants McKinney. And, I don't disagree. I think if you draft Xavier McKinney, you're in a really good spot. He's another guy that can move around and things like that and play in the slot, play in the deep. But I'm going to go with Winfield in this case. But I don't disagree about Xavier McKinney. Played at an extremely high level, and I like the way that he would fit. And of course, if you're doing that, you're probably moving on from Anthony Harris. But let's assume that position kind of goes either or. I might have reached a little on Antoine Winfield Jr., but I also think that he's a special player in terms of his instincts for the game, and I have a lot of appreciation for that. There are a few things that seem to consistently come up when you're talking about players who, you read their draft profiles, you listen to the analysts talk about them, you watch them play. When someone has high intelligence, instincts, and meets an athletic profile and production, that's checking every single box, and that's what Antoine Winfield Jr. does. All right, so we are now in the second round, and I've got my guy right away. So right before the Vikings picked Cesar Ruiz, a guy that I think they should be interested in for Michigan. Damon Arnett, the corner from Ohio State, goes. Jalen Reagor from TCU, the wide receiver, could have some interest from the Vikings. Very athletic. But my guy here is going to be, and I'm sorry if I mess up his name, but Justin Matabuki from Texas A&M, a guy that put up great numbers in terms of his pass pressures. Also, at the NFL Combine, was one of the high performers there and really stood out. So Mike Zimmer is now at his house, just toasting Diet Dr. Peppers, just like me, celebrating the defensive line because he's got Justin Matabuki and Antoine Winfield Jr. and Jeff Gladney. Now tell me in the comments if you want to hear, whose draft sim do you like better? Do you like the Kirk Cousins draft sim or do you like the Mike Zimmer draft sim? Because, in a way, I think that the Kirk Cousins draft sim, you end up maybe reaching a little more on some certain guys like Austin Jackson, the tackle. There's some people that think he's the second rounder. Or maybe, you take a little bit more of a risk on Laviska Chenault if he's the wide receiver that you like. The prospects on the defensive side here are really good. And these positions are pretty deep at safety and at cornerback. So we've come away with three very good prospects in Jeff Gladney, Antoine Winfield Jr., and Justin Matabuki. And now we're into the third round. All right, so now we're thinking, okay, we could go either way. You're just trying to get good players. You could go another defensive guy. You could go on the offensive side. And the way that my board has played out here, for any of you Jake Fromm fans, Jake Fromm has already been taken. I say that with sarcasm. Has anyone said that they were a Jake Fromm fan? But Jalen Hurts, and I'm sorry, I'm sure that there are Georgia fans that like him. But in terms of draft prospects, everyone wants Jalen Hurts in the third round or second round on draft sims. But I've never been told by anybody in the comments or anything else that they were desperate for Jake Fromm. But things have played out pretty well here for us to get a guard who, by the way, Todd McShay considers one of the top guards in this entire draft, which is Robert Hunt from Louisiana, a guy that had some injuries and maybe struggled a little bit from that standpoint, but has major power and was compared to Brandon Treff on the Pro Football Focus draft guide. So I'm going to go with Robert Hunt here. He is a tackle, but a lot of people see him as a guard. And now we have one more pick in the third round for the Mike Zimmer draft. And I think Zimmer would get on board with an offensive lineman or two, considering at the NFL Combine he told us, yeah, Kirk Cousins does need better pass protection. So with our final pick here, I'm thinking about still having to go in the direction of offense just because of the way the board is played out. So even though this is the Zimmer draft, we've got on the board is Van Jefferson from Florida, Donovan Peoples-Jones, an absolute athletic freak out of Michigan, and we've got Damian Lewis, the guard out of LSU. Anybody going to be against drafting two guards in the third round? So this is the position that you put yourself in if you try to fill all the spots on defense first. And we still didn't get a defensive end either, is that when you get to that third round, you're saying, all right, well, we've got some good guards, some good wide receivers, but something's going to have to get left out here. So let's go with Donovan Peoples-Jones. So we still end up, even in the Zimmer draft, we end up with a wide receiver and we end up with a guard. They're just both in the third round. And both of those guys have the potential to have an impact right away. So what do we like? Do we like the Zimmer draft or do we like the Kirk Cousins draft? I'll tell you, from my standpoint, just looking at the numbers, just looking at what wins and trying to play to your strengths, which is kind of like my new beat the drum thing for the NFL draft for the Vikings, is play to your strengths. You have a good quarterback, you have some good weapons, make them stronger, make yourself more dangerous, and trust Mike Zimmer to elevate your defensive play with his giant defensive brain. And the fact that there's still a handful of veterans on the free agent market that you can get on the defensive side, fill those spots out. Now, that's kind of the way I lean. I just think it would be exciting to have Tyler Johnson, Laviska Chenault, Adam Thielen, B.C. Johnson. That's not a bad receiving core if Tyler Johnson works out and Chenault turns into a good playmaker to go along with Irv Smith, who's going to play a ton next year, Kyle Rudolph, who will be reliable, Delvin Cook, who's going to come out of the backfield and catch passes, and Alexander Madison as well. That makes you feel pretty good about Cousins if you add those offensive linemen to the mix and you assume that it can be worse than what they got from the right and left guard last year. That's the Kirk draft. On the other side, though, you do end up with Antoine Winfield. You end up with an interior pass rusher that they did not have last year, and they certainly missed that. I thought Shamar Stephen had 6 pressures the entire season on over 300 snaps. And that's just not doing a whole lot for your defense. And you do have to have corners. Jeff Gladney is a high ceiling, high athletic corner. And then we end up picking up a receiver and a guard later. But the likelihood of them making a huge impact, maybe Hunt could, but Peoples-Jones, he's probably going to have to develop. So that the likelihood of them making a huge impact in the first year is not high. Which one do you prefer? Chad in the comments says he prefers the Kirk draft. The old defense wins championships isn't really true anymore. Let me tell you how I feel about that, because I would also I'm sure you figured this out, I would go with the Kirk draft. And I would ask Mike Zimmer to put in some of these guys that they've drafted in the past in the later rounds and develop them more. Your Jaleel Johnson, Armin Watts, Fadi Adenabo, those guys. I mean, I think those are talented players they could put in. Mike Hughes and Holton Hill on the outside doesn't sound like it would be any worse than they were with Trey Waynes and Xavier Rhodes last year. I mean, Holton Hill didn't find his way into the game a whole lot, but I think he should have last year. If they were going to keep him around after all of those things that he went through with the 8-game suspension, that means that they really like him and that he's very talented. So if they started those guys, signed another veteran corner or two, kept Anthony Harris, I think you still have a good defense that can finish in the top 10 in points. That's all you need to be a legitimate contender for the Super Bowl. But on the offensive side, I think you need to be a cut above that. You can't just be the 12th best offense and be a legitimate Super Bowl contender. And I agree with Daniel in the comments that priority number 1 should be fixing the offensive line. Yeah, I agree. Now the receivers, yes, it's true that someone like BC Johnson might develop along the way. I fully expect Irv Smith to maybe he's the new Owen Daniels for Gary Kubiak for sure. Yeah, they do have some weapons, and I agree that priority number one should be fixing the offensive line. But the more guys that you have that create problems for the other team in terms of playmakers and wide receivers, then I think the more dangerous you are. And that's one thing that goes forgotten about with Kyle Shanahan's great schemes of the last couple times he's been to the Super Bowl with Atlanta and with San Francisco. Think about all the playmakers they had in the backfield: Devontae Freeman, and you had Tevin Coleman there. For the Falcons, they had three wide receivers who were playing well. And then last year with San Francisco, they add Emmanuel Sanders to the mix. And then you have Deebo Samuel, three different running backs who were good. And I think that goes a little bit under the radar because they did have such a good defense. Dave says that Zimmer isn't the defensive wizard he once was. Now, I would say this, that it is a good point about hiring Dom Capers to help out. But I actually was impressed that the Vikings came away last year as a top five scoring against defense when their cornerback play was so poor that they were still able to do that. And Everson Griffin down the second half of the season did not play as well as he did in the first half, and they were still able to put on a very good defensive performance in New Orleans and win a playoff game in large part because of their defense and because of their scheme. So I don't think that Mike Zimmer has lost his fastball. I think what happened was Xavier Rhodes lost his fastball and everybody kept throwing at him. And if there's one criticism I would have for Zimmer last year, it was that he stuck with Rhodes when he probably should have had Mike Hughes and Holton Hill in there playing over Xavier Rhodes quite a bit more. But do I think that Zimmer can scheme his way to being the 10th best defense in the league, even if they've lost a good amount of talent? I do. Yeah, I do think that. And if you give me the 10th best defense in the league and a Kirk Cousins with another career year because he has so many weapons, and as Daniel brought up, an improved offensive line, that to me screams you're still a contender when a lot of people think that 2020 is not going to be a year where you can compete. Daniel asks my thought on Chad Beebe. I really like Chad Beebe. He's a quick route runner. He's open all the time. But the problem is that he gets hurt. And, last year it was kind of a freak thing against the Oakland Raiders. He actually got flagged on the play. He was trying to throw a block, which I totally respect from a guy that's 5'9" or 5'10". But in my mind, you can't just compete or I'm sorry, rely on Chad Beebe to compete for one of those top three positions in the wide receiver group because you just don't know if he's going to be able to stay healthy. As a receiver, a pure receiver, a slot guy, one of those quick wide receivers at that position, I really do like him, and I think he could catch 40 or 50 passes out of that position, but staying healthy for a long time is not easy. So, everyone who's chimed in, I really appreciate you. This has been lots of fun to do two different draft sims. One if you were Kirk Cousins, one if you were Mike Zimmer, and I would appreciate more feedback from you folks on whether it's Facebook or Twitter. I'm at Matthew Coller, Coller. Do your own draft sims. Do them with themes. I mean, we are almost there, people. We are getting down the back stretch to the NFL draft, and so have fun with it. I really enjoy doing these two and talking with all of you guys about it. So we will catch you next time. Next Saturday night, 8 o'clock, we're going to do it up until the draft. So I guess we got, maybe one or two more Saturdays. Just real quick, a question from Cole that I want to answer. Chances that the Vikings draft Jaylon Johnson in round 1. So I would be surprised if they draft him in the first round, but I really like Jaylon Johnson. I think he could be a second round draft pick that they look at or even potentially trade up for. And I'm mostly sold on his production was very good at Utah, and that's what you want if you're playing at Utah. And two, the interviews I've heard from him, he comes across a highly intelligent player. And having been around Mike Zimmer now for 4 seasons, I know that at the very top of his list for defensive backs, he wants smart guys that are going to be versatile. They're going to be able to pick up on things quickly. They're going to be able to learn his defense, move inside if he needs them to do that, which it took a couple of years for Mackenzie Alexander to learn how to do that. But Alexander was a very bright guy, and he figured it out. So I definitely like Jaylon Johnson for the Vikings. but first round seems like that would be reaching. So thanks for the question, Cole. And feel free to tweet me any other draft questions. I'm always happy to answer them, always happy to respond and grade your draft sims and things like that. So make sure you do it. Had a lot of fun with this. We'll see you next Saturday night, 8 o'clock Central, when we draft sim again. Until then, stay safe, drink your Diet Peppers, Diet Dr. Peppers. See you later.